Episode 43, The Emperor's Banquet. Yoshi sat in the darkened council chamber in Fire Flower's underground base. The room was mostly bare, its only bit of decoration being a fire flower painted onto the wall. A dim lamp from the table's center provided all the light they needed. Yoshi sat at the head of the table. All of his chief lieutenants were there. Kubainur, the rebel leader who had been fighting against Bowser's rule for decades, Toadifacus, Fire Flower's financial backer, Carl Fangs, ex-Gremling crew raid captain, and several more individuals who shared his cause in bringing Emperor Bowser down. Each of their heads were turned to him. They looked to him for leadership, and why shouldn't they? Thanks to his plan, Neon City, the Koopa Empire's heart of vice, had been destroyed. Sector 4 was fractured, its fortresses seized by both Neo-Empire forces and Bowser loyalists, but in the chaos the Sand Kingdom's people had finally got to experience freedom. It was essentially considered a dead state by both sides, far too much trouble for either to control when they had to worry about more important things. It had been Fire Flower's greatest victory. So why did Yoshi feel so hollow? It was all Luigi's fault, Yoshi mused as he faced his lieutenants. He had been hoping to fight this fight together. It had been his every intention to throw a feast for Luigi once he had recuperated from his fight with Roy, but then Luigi had abandoned them? Were his words true? Had he become just as bad? Perhaps even worse, than the Koopas? Mario wouldn't have approved of his actions, Yoshi knew, but what had Mario's brand of heroics got the Mushroom Kingdom in the end? He had been a paragon of goodness, practically a superhero to the people of the Mushroom Kingdom, a guy with a bright and optimistic smile who every little kid wanted to be when they grew up. Yet each and every time he had beat the Koopa King, Mario had spared his life. All it would have taken is a little more force in that jump, and King Bowser's reign would be over. Princess Peach could have taken the Koopa Kingdom for herself and changed it with her kind leadership, or, if that was too conqueror-seeming for her, she could work with the Koopas and set up a new leader. A new dynasty of kings, or a republic if they'd prefer, and bring peace between the two nations. But instead of all that, Bowser and his children had been allowed to run free, launching a raid on the Mushroom Kingdom nearly every week, and in the end it had meant the end of not only the Mushroom Kingdom, but freedom for every soul in the world. He had only done what was necessary. People wouldn't look up to him like they'd looked up to the Mario brothers, but the history books would say that it was Yoshi of Fire Flower who brought the gift of freedom back of the Mushroom world. But even as Yoshi thought of it, images kept on flashing through his mind. Kooper and Koops, Mario's old companions, who he had fought with back-to-back at the Battle of Toad Town. A smiling, laughing Koopa child who had cheered him on as he drifted down Mario Circuit on one of the annual card tournaments. Even the face of Bowser himself. When they had first met, he had only been a kid. A bratty, obnoxious entitled kid, but it had been Kamek's teaching and his overprivileged life that had made him the way he was. Nobody was born evil. Not Bowser, and certainly not the entire Koopa race. The nuclear bomb had been meant for Roy Koopa and his soldiers, and yet certainly the majority of the casualties had been innocent. Who was to say they even supported Roy? Perhaps they were just trying to scrape by in the shadow of their tyrant's castle, imperial citizens who had had no role or say in the conquest of the world and nothing against non-Koopas. It was necessary, Yoshi told himself again. But even as he thought it over, the more it weighed upon him. It was too late to stop now. Fire Flower had to continue on its path until the Imperial Citadel was burnt to the ground. It was the path he had chosen, and he'd have to stick with it. Yoshi, sir, came the voice of Kubainur. Are you ready to begin? Yoshi snapped back into focus. His subordinates, of course. How long had he kept them waiting? Yes, he said. Let's start. Toadificus. He turned to the mustached green-capped toad. Please go over our organization's statistics. As you wish. Toadificus nodded. I have placed an order for 300 bombs from the Robo Gang. They will be here within a week. 3 of our airships which were damaged in the attack on Neon City have been repaired. Finally, I'm afraid that the amount of deflections are increasing. 30 more of us left for Luigi's organization. It appears to be a growing trend. Those idiots. Coupainer hissed. They'll never get anywhere. Yoshi leaned back on his chair and closed his eyes. Coupainer was wrong. Drawn by the prospect of fighting under the remaining Mario brother, Luigi's organization seemed to be growing. It had Generation 2 airships now, Yoshi knew, something Fire Flower had never dared try and steal. Perhaps they could have, if they hadn't been so concerned with bombing Koopa Troop fortresses. But it was too late for regrets. Once the new bombs get here, we're launching a new attack. Yoshi sighed in a resigned voice. Luigi was moving forward, but what could he do? People would follow Luigi because with him was hope and a promise of a better future. All he had to offer was flames and death. I'm planning an attack on the Koopa Troop's main headquarters in the Bean Kingdom. Our spies have reported its garrison is the weakest it's been in years. The Koopas have never considered the Bean Kingdom too valuable after the whole Bean Star/Sticker Star ordeal, and with the recent destruction of Bowser Jr.'s armada, nearly every non-central fortress has a skeleton garrison since everybody's been pulled to the front lines. We can finally free the Beanish people. Another shining victory for us. The yellow-scaled Kremling Karl Fangs laughed. A victory that wouldn't be possible without Luigi. Yoshi sighed. Because of his group's efforts, the Mushroom Kingdom was almost completely free of Koopa forces. Once the Bean Kingdom's garrison fell, there would be no reinforcements. What am I doing? Yoshi thought, leaning back and staring at the ceiling. I haven't felt this lost since Mario died. Toadificus excited the council room alongside the other lieutenants. Some were chatting to each other about their hopes for the new plan, but Toadificus didn't join them. He smiled, his mustache bristling. Fire Flower soon was going to reach boiling point. Its purpose was nearly fulfilled. Yoshi will meet with the others in battle eventually, regardless of if he's on Luigi's side or against him. The Toad mused. And then, they will all be swallowed up in the Grand Star's ambition. Bowser Jr. took a deep breath and walked through the huge double doors into the Imperial Citadel's ballroom. The ballroom was a clear example of the Empire's wealth. It was a humongous hall that could fit several hundred people, and chandeliers made of solid gold hung from the ceiling. Massive windows covered both walls, looking out at the brightly lit Koopa Central, which dyed the floor of brown marble a multitude of hues as its lights lit up the sky. Banners depicting the Imperial emblem hung from the walls, and the same emblem was etched on the room's center, with the Bowser head made of ruby. An elevated gallery ran around the room, with a balcony directly across from Bowser Jr., which was flanked by 2 golden Bowser statues. On the gallery, an orchestra played classical music, an old song, written nearly 400 years ago. All the modern classics had been written by Ludwig, of course, and it would be completely inappropriate to play them with the prince's loyalties being what they were. There were many round tables draped with white cloth placed around the hall, and at them were seated the Koopa Empire's elite. Bowser Jr. saw lords and ladies, business leaders and politicians, heroes who had distinguished themselves in the war and trusted members of high command. It was the single most exclusive party in the entire world, and, if you were a higher class sort of person, at first glance it looked like the sort of place you could have a wonderful time. but there was a somber atmosphere that filled the ballroom. Everyone in the room, from Fat Lord Shellis Couple to Grand General Sheldon, looking very crisp in his white dress uniform, knew that their side was not likely to win in the war. When Ludwig sat the throne, he would not look favorably on the people who had resisted him. No wonder so many were defecting to the Neo-Empire's side. Bowser Jr. approached an empty table. A dutiful Boo servant appeared, pushing forward a large chair built to accommodate his bulk. Bowser Jr. sat down on it and looked up at the balcony, from which was hung the largest imperial banner. In a way, wasn't he a traitor, too? He had joined forces with none other than Luigi himself. If his father had heard about this, he might very well just hand the throne to Ludwig in disgust.
Does he even care enough to do that?
Bowser Jr. wondered. His father had been like an empty shell for years now, and if the rumors were true it was only getting worse. The battle was going to happen once Bowser Jr. returned to the Mushroom Kingdom. He had left General Spiker behind to go over the final preparations. His spies had reported a fleet under the command of his brother Larry massing at Rogueport. He'd take his own fleet and meet it in battle over the ocean, with Luigi's forces at his side. Would any good come of it? Even if they'd be able to win against Larry, would indulging Luigi only further the Koopa Empire's destruction? A Magic Koopa clad in grey robes walked to the edge of the balcony and the entire room fell into a hush.
Introducing His Royal Highness, King of the Koopas and Conqueror of the World, Emperor Bowser Koopa.
Slowly, Bowser made his appearance at the balcony. Bowser Jr. tightened his fist. Bowser was dressed regally, in his red cape and golden spiked shoulder pads, but he had never looked older. Half of the hairs on his head looked grey, and he walked with a stooping limp. What had happened to the fearsome guy who had been able to casually stroll into Peach's castle, grab the princess, and walk back to the airship while the Toads panicked? His father looked 2 steps away from becoming a dry bones.
I'll make things right for you, Dad.
Bowser Jr. promised himself.
You have my word, as your son and the heir to the throne.
Bowser placed his hand on the golden railing.
Well,
he grunted, his voice carrying across the room.
I guess I'm 50 now.
Bowser scoffed and shook his head.
Look at all of you, crammed into this room like it's some massive party. Fat lot o' good that'll do for you. Go gorge yourself on a pile of hot drumsticks, 'cause it's probably going to be your last time.
The guests murmured amongst themselves. Bowser Jr. closed his eyes. It hurt him to see his father this way. Wasn't King Bowser's most defining trait the fact that he never gave up, no matter how much the odds were against him?
21 years ago, I conquered this whole stupid world.
Bowser said, before laughing. He said, smiling and baring his fangs.
I've been wanting to rule the world since I've been 4. I've launched more invasions than even I remember, raided Starhaven itself, even tried to recreate the whole freaking universe in my image, but I always lost. Then one day I won. Bet you were all surprised about that, right? I actually did it. Then it was one victory after another, until we built this fancy castle and I got myself some big shiny new throne. But you know what?
Bowser pounded the railing and swept his crimson gaze over the ballroom wildly.
It was never about the power. Yeah, power's awesome, but what's the point of an empire without an empress? I must have the universe's worst luck. Mario finally dies, and then Peach has to go ahead and follow him. Yeah, I know, nobody knows if she's really dead, but it's been over 2 decades and she hasn't shown her stupid, pretty face. What's even the point?
Bowser looked down directly at Bowser Jr., and the younger Koopa met his father's gaze.
How long has it been since we've even had a normal conversation?
The Koopa Prince wondered sadly.
Junior, if you beat Ludwig, the throne's yours. If he beats you, I'll let him have it. None of it matters in the end. Not a single bit of it. You can have your war. I just want my princess.
And with that, Emperor Bowser Koopa turned around and walked back to where he came. Outside one of the huge windows that lined the ballroom walls, Cammy hovered, out of sight of all of the guests.
Bowser!
She thought to herself. It was getting worse. She had been surprised he hadn't simply abdicated the throne.
There's still hope for him.
Cammy thought to herself, looking down at her wand. Once her potion was finished, the strength of Bowser's youth would be back. No, it would be amplified. All she needed now was the final ingredient. The diamond milk of a crystal coconut, to force the Dark Star's power to join with the potion base. Cammy turned around the view away from the walls and towers of the Imperial Citadel, into the dark skies over Koopa Central. Her final ingredient had proved extremely difficult to find. Everywhere she looked, crystal coconuts and their milk had been confiscated, either gone missing or stolen by mysterious forces. Only they weren't so mysterious now, thanks to the research she had done.
7 Stars doesn't want anybody brewing potions powerful enough to mess with their plans.
Cammy thought, before smiling and urging her broom forward as she flew into a cloud.
Now that'll come back to bite 'em once I track them down.